Imagine for a second liquidating your entire 401k, right? Selling your house, stuffing all that cash into a duffel bag, and just dropping it at the feet of your local community leader.
Yeah, with no tax deductions at all.
Exactly. No legally binding trust fund, nothing like that.
Yeah.
Just handing over your entire net worth so it can be used to, like, buy groceries and pay rent for people you barely even know.
Which sounds completely wild to us today.
It really does. But thousands of people actually did this in the first century. And it brings us to a fascinating question that, well, I am so excited to welcome you to today's deep dive to explore.
It's a great topic.
We are looking at a historical, religious, and economic debate sparked by an article from the Libertarian Catholic, and it's titled, "Were the Early Christians Socialist?"
And that premise alone, I mean, it creates a lot of friction right out of the gate.
Oh, for sure.
Because we have this modern tendency to look at ancient events and just, try to map our current political vocabulary right onto them. People read certain passages from the historical texts of the early church, they see this massive pooling of resources, and they immediately apply a modern economic label.
Right. They see sharing and think, boom, socialism. Now, before we get into the weeds here, I need to put a quick disclaimer out there for you listening, because we are dealing with a source that touches the absolute third rail of both religion and politics.
Oh, yeah, the big ones.
Right. I mean, we are analyzing arguments about socialism, libertarianism, and scripture. So our job today is not to take a theological or political stance. We are acting entirely as your impartial guides.
Just looking at the text.
Exactly. We're just holding this specific author's argument up to the light to see how they differentiate early Christian generosity from modern economic definitions of socialism, specifically focusing on this really cool engine of, well, free will.
And maintaining that analytical distance is honestly the only way to actually hear the historical and economic argument being presented. You literally cannot evaluate the author's thesis if you are, busy arguing with their political identity in your head.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really grasp why this source argues these early believers were not socialists, we have to look at the exact historical text that makes people claim they were in the first place.
Right, the Book of Acts.
Yeah, specifically chapter 4, verses 32 through 37. It describes this community under intense pressure, heavily marginalized, who suddenly operate with what the text calls one heart and one soul.
It's a very powerful image.
It is. And the text says no one claimed their possessions were their own, but instead all things were common unto them.
And see, that phrasing right there, all things were common, that is the lightning rod.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. For a modern reader, especially someone analyzing economic systems, that phrase immediately evokes a Marxist utopia. It strongly suggests the total abolition of private property.
Which, I mean, the text goes even further to support that vibe. It describes individuals who owned lands or houses, selling them, bringing the profits, and literally surrendering those funds to the apostles.
Just handing it over.
Yeah. And that money was then distributed to anyone who had a need. The source highlights a specific guy, Joseph, surnamed Barnabas. He owned a field, sold it, and handed over the cash.
Barnabas is basically the poster child for this movement in the text.
He really is. And when I read this, I am immediately picturing like a modern commune or maybe a mutual aid fund that pops up during a massive natural disaster. Everyone drops their paycheck into a single bucket to ensure nobody starves.
That's a really good comparison.
But here's my question for you. This sounds exactly like the classic socialist ideal of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. How does the source differentiate this from actual socialism?
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism of that distribution. The author of the article draws a really definitive boundary between grassroots charity and systemic socialism.
Okay, what's the boundary?
It is defined entirely by the presence or the complete absence of state enforcement and coercion. Modern economic socialism fundamentally requires a centralized authority, a government apparatus.
Right, to mandate the redistribution of wealth.
Exactly. The state either owns the means of production or it legally compels the redistribution of the fruits of that production through taxation. If you refuse to participate, you face legal consequences.
Like fines or imprisonment?
Or asset seizure.
Yeah.
The system relies on force.
Which means the system functions regardless of how the individual actually feels about it. I mean, you don't have to love your neighbor to pay your income tax, right? You just have to fear an IRS audit.
That is a perfect way to put it.
But what you are saying, and what the source is arguing, is that the communal sharing in Acts 4 had zero enforcement mechanism.
Zero. I mean, the Roman Empire certainly wasn't enforcing it.
Obviously not.
And the church leadership wasn't levying a property tax on its members either. The source argues this was not a top-down economic policy drafted by some central planning committee.
So it was completely organic.
Totally organic. It was a grassroots response driven entirely by the believers' internal spiritual transformation. They were just attempting to live out the teachings of Jesus, which demanded radical generosity and this profound detachment from material wealth.
So projecting the term socialism onto this community is essentially anachronistic.
It really is.
It takes a bureaucratic, state-enforced economic system from the 19th or 20th century and tries to, plug it into a first-century community driven by religious devotion.
It doesn't fit.
It's kind of like calling a family dinner a socialist enterprise just because the parents don't charge their kids for the mashed potatoes. I mean, the motive is love, not legislation.
That's spot on. The author bluntly states that charity is not socialism. The defining characteristic of the Acts 4 community was voluntary action.
Meaning they had a choice.
Exactly. They surrendered their wealth because they chose to, not because they were legally compelled to do so.
But, okay, if we are dealing with a purely voluntary system where people are selling massive assets to support the group, the social dynamics of that must have been incredibly intense.
Oh, without a doubt.
Because when the prevailing culture is one of extreme radical generosity, the social prestige goes to the people who give the most. Like, Barnabas probably looked like an absolute hero.
He was a celebrity in that context.
Right. And human nature being what it is, if someone wants that social credit but doesn't actually want to lose their wealth, they are going to try and game the system.
Well, the historical text actually documents that exact psychological phenomenon occurring almost immediately.
Really? How soon?
Right in the very next chapter. And the source actually uses this subsequent narrative as its strongest piece of evidence against the socialist label.
Ah, this is the story of Ananias and his wife, Sapphira, in Acts chapter 5.
That's the one?
So they decide to sell a piece of property, presumably seeing the immense respect Barnabas received. But instead of surrendering the entire profit, they secretly hold back a portion for themselves.
And the text explicitly calls it fraud.
Yeah, because they bring the remaining cash to the apostles, but they present it as if it were the total sum of the sale.
And they wanted the badge of radical generosity, but they didn't want to absorb the actual financial sacrifice.
They wanted to have their cake and eat it too.
Exactly. They wanted to maintain a secret safety net while benefiting from the communal prestige.
Okay, but this is where I have to play devil's advocate. Because Peter, the leader of the apostles, publicly confronts Ananias. He accuses him of lying to the Holy Ghost and keeping back part of the price of the land.
He does.
Now, I have read this passage, and I have to push back on the author's premise here. In the narrative, the moment Peter confronts him, Ananias drops dead.
Yes, he does.
And then, a few hours later, his wife lies about the money, and she drops dead too. That looks exactly like the ultimate enforcement mechanism to me. I mean, how is that not a mandatory wealth tax?
It definitely sounds intense to a modern ear.
It reads like Peter is basically saying, you withheld funds from the collective, and now you face the ultimate penalty.
And viewed purely through a modern systemic lens, it absolutely looks like lethal enforcement of wealth redistribution. However, the article directs our attention to the specific words Peter uses during the confrontation.
Okay. Before Ananias dies.
Right, before the sudden death. The source argues Peter's actual dialogue proves the exact opposite of a mandatory wealth tax.
All right, well, I have the quote right here. Peter says, "Whilst it remained, did it not remain to thee? And after it was sold, was it not in thy power?"
Notice that last part.
Wait, he is saying, was it not in thy power? That actually changes the entire framing of the confrontation.
It really does.
Because Peter isn't claiming the money belonged to the church. He's explicitly stating the property belonged to Ananias before he sold it, and the cash belonged to Ananias after he sold it.
And the source leans heavily on that exact sentence. It is an explicit affirmation of private property rights by the primary leader of the early church. Peter is basically telling Ananias that nobody forced him to sell the land. And even after he chose to sell it, he was under zero obligation to give a single coin to the community.
It was entirely in his power to keep it.
Exactly.
So the fatal crime wasn't capitalism. The crime was fraud.
Right.
Ananias and Sapphira were not condemned because they owned a property or because they wanted to keep some of their own money. They were condemned because they lied to the community.
And in their theological framework, they tried to lie to God.
They manufactured an illusion of total sacrifice.
The hypocrisy is what drew the condemnation, not the retention of wealth. The source uses this to decisively argue that believers were never coerced into relinquishing their property.
Because if it were actual socialism, the rules would be different.
Exactly. In a true socialist system, the total sum of that sale would have been legally owed to the collective from the start, or the property wouldn't have been privately owned in the first place. But Peter confirms the private ownership and the freedom to do with the capital whatever Ananias wished. So the tragedy underscores a demand for absolute honesty and transparency within this voluntary network, not a demand for wealth confiscation.
That makes a lot of sense. If the gesture wasn't freely chosen, it meant nothing, which actually makes the extreme generosity of the wider community even more staggering when you think about it.
It really highlights their conviction.
They didn't have to give a dime, yet they gave everything. But this creates a massive structural question for me.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if you have a community where private property is affirmed, but people are voluntarily dropping bags of silver at the leadership's feet, how did the leaders themselves operate?
The corruption question.
Exactly, because history is full of utopian movements where the founders end up living in luxury while the followers, eat scraps. Did the apostles just establish themselves as a new, wealthy elite managing this massive voluntary treasury?
It's a totally fair question. But we actually have a very clear historical record of how the early leadership navigated that exact temptation. And the source highlights the example of St. Paul to illustrate it.
Okay, St. Paul.
Yeah, Paul wasn't one of the original 12 apostles, but he became perhaps the most influential figure in expanding this community across the Roman world.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The article looks at Paul's behavior in Acts 20 and his second letter to the Thessalonians. Paul doesn't just manage the funds. He actively refuses to take a cut for himself.
He's very strict about it.
He tells the community, "I have coveted no one's silver or gold or clothes." Instead, he points out that he worked with his own hands to meet his own needs and the needs of his traveling companions.
And we know from the historical context that Paul was the tent maker.
Which is not easy work.
No, it was grueling physical manual labor. He was literally stitching heavy canvas and leather by day so that he could preach and lead the community by night.
This is like the ancient equivalent of a modern startup founder.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
You see, founders who refuse to take a salary from the company's early revenue, right? They sleep under their desk, they eat ramen, and they pour all their sweat equity into the project until it is completely self-sustaining.
And they do it for a very specific reason.
Exactly. They do it specifically to establish a hardcore cultural standard for the rest of their team. Paul explicitly states in his letters that he had the theological and moral right to receive financial support from the people he was leading.
But he doesn't take it.
No, he voluntarily surrendered that right, choosing brutal physical labor instead, just to offer himself as a living model.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Paul's behavior really cements the central thesis of the article. We are looking at a leader who is violently opposed to establishing a parasitical relationship with the community.
He's not living off the grid of their donations.
Right. He models intense personal industry, hard work, and complete self-reliance. And the purpose of that hard work isn't personal enrichment. It is to generate enough excess capital to voluntarily help those who truly cannot help themselves.
And Paul even quotes Jesus to justify this grueling schedule, saying, "It is more blessed to give than to receive."
Which is a famous line, but think about what it practically means.
Well, you literally cannot experience the blessing of giving unless you first engage in the industry required to produce something and then freely choose to give it away.
The author argues this framework is fundamentally incompatible with an enforced top-down economic system.
How so?
Because in a system where the state preemptively takes from the productive to distribute to the needy, the individual loses the moral weight of the choice.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Paul wanted his communities to be highly productive, specifically so they had the capacity to choose radical generosity. The virtue was located entirely in the free will of the actor.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you try to synthesize these ancient historical accounts with modern economic theories?
It's a lot to process.
It is. But if we pull all these threads together, the Libertarian Catholic article argues that the early Christian community did indeed achieve a breathtaking level of social care. They operated a network where, incredibly, no one was needy.
A truly remarkable achievement.
But the defining characteristics of this society were voluntary action, free will, extreme integrity, and personal industry. It was not defined by enforced socialism, government mandates, or the ideological abolition of private property.
This raises an important question about how we view the mechanics of a healthy society.
What's the question?
Well, the defining characteristic of this historical group was internal motivation. Their actions were generated from the inside out. It was driven by a deeply held, shared spiritual conviction that completely transformed how they viewed their own wealth.
As opposed to modern systems.
Right. Modern socialism relies on external coercion. It utilizes the apparatus of the state to manage the distribution of resources from the outside in, overriding the individual's internal desires or attachments to their property.
So it is the difference between a community organizing itself through shared values and profound interpersonal trust versus a society being organized by legal compliance and the threat of a state audit.
They are entirely different paradigms of human organization.
One relies on a transformed worldview, and the other relies on a tax collector.
Exactly. And recognizing that historical and psychological distinction is crucial for reading these ancient texts accurately. You miss the sheer radicalism of what Barnabas or Paul did if you assume they were just following a mandatory civic policy.
Because it wasn't a policy at all.
Right. The power of their actions came entirely from the fact that they could have legally and morally chosen not to do it.
Which leaves you with a deeply provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Yes, something to really chew on.
If the early Christians were motivated purely by radical love and free will to achieve a society that successfully eradicated poverty within its ranks without a single government mandate or enforced wealth tax, how does that challenge our modern assumptions about human nature and societal organization?
It's a challenging thought.
Because today we lean almost exclusively on top-down, massive bureaucratic structures to try to solve systemic poverty. We treat it as an engineering problem for the state to solve.
We do.
So is a purely voluntary, community-driven support network of that scale even possible in our modern, highly individualized world?
I wonder.
Or did it only work back in the first century because of the intense, shared spiritual conviction of a small, heavily persecuted group who genuinely believed their wealth belonged to God? It forces us to ask what we might have gained in efficiency by outsourcing our charity to government systems and what we might have profoundly lost in our capacity for voluntary, radical community. Thank you so much for joining us as we explore this fascinating intersection of history, economics, and human nature.